Look at this blouse. Feel the fabric in your mind. It might just look like an ordinary piece of clothing to you, maybe a simple black shirt forgotten in the back of a vintage closet, but to me, it is an absolute lifeline. My name is Evelyn Vance. I am 83 years old, and for a very, very long time, I carried a sorrow so utterly crushing that I honestly didn't think I would survive another winter. But I did. I am still here because of one unpredictable, unforgettable night, because of a spontaneous gift from a woman whose voice touched millions of souls across the world, but whose fiercely gentle heart saved mine. That woman was the lead singer of Roxette, Marie Fredriksson, and this is the true story of how she reached into my silent world and pulled me out of the dark. To understand what this simple piece of fabric truly means to me, you have to understand the depth of the abyss I was in and everything I had lost to get there. I have lived in Providence, Rhode Island, my entire life. For decades, my entire existence was defined by sound. I was a dedicated piano and choir teacher. My small, cozy house was never, ever quiet. It was constantly filled with the clumsy but beautiful scales of young students learning to play their first notes, the rich harmonies of the local church choir practicing in my living room on Tuesday evenings, the crisp rustle of turning sheet music, and the constant, comforting hum of a life lived entirely through melody. Music wasn't just my profession. It was my primary language. It was how I connected with human beings, how I prayed, how I understood the world, and how the world understood me. But then, right as I was approaching my 50s, the music was stolen from me. It didn't happen all at once, which somehow made the torture even crueler. It started as a faint, annoying ringing, a persistent hum in my left ear that simply wouldn't go away. Then came a series of severe, relentless infections. Despite all the treatments, within a single devastating year, I lost the hearing in my left ear completely, and the hearing in my right ear was left terribly distorted and fragile. The doctors sat me down in a sterile, bright office and told me it was permanent and irreversible. I remember the exact Tuesday afternoon I walked into my living room and closed the heavy wooden lid of my beloved piano for what I thought would be the final time. The mahogany felt freezing cold under my trembling hands. I sat alone in the middle of the room, and for the first time in my entire life, the silence was absolute. It was terrifying. It wasn't a peaceful, restful silence. It was a suffocating, heavy, aggressive void. When the music left my life, it took every single drop of color and joy with it. I felt as though I had been physically erased from the earth. I wasn't just grieving the devastating loss of my hearing, I was grieving the complete loss of my identity. Who exactly was Evelyn Vance if she couldn't hear the perfect pitch of a middle C? Who was she if she couldn't teach a nervous child how to find their confidence in their voice? That profound, unmooring loss spiraled rapidly into a darkness I could no longer control. Days blurred endlessly into weeks. The bitter, biting Providence winter didn't help at all. The freezing gray skies outside perfectly matched the absolute desolation inside my chest. I stopped answering the telephone. I stopped opening the heavy living room curtains. Just the physical act of getting out of bed felt like trying to walk through deep, freezing water. I felt entirely invisible, entirely useless, and completely discarded by a world that was moving on without me. I had convinced myself that my story was permanently over, that all the beautiful, vibrant parts of my life were firmly in the rearview mirror, and I was just an old woman waiting out the clock in a silent house. I was entirely out of hope, trapped in a quiet prison of my own making, unable to find a single solitary reason to keep living. My niece, Sarah, was the only one who stubbornly refused to let me fade away into the background of my own life. She was in her early 20s back then, full of that relentless, fiery, and beautiful energy that I used to have before the absolute silence took over my world. One freezing November afternoon, she barged right into my dark, stuffy living room, threw open those heavy curtains I hadn't touched in months, and slapped 2 tickets onto my dusty coffee table. Roxette, Boston, 1992. I looked at her as if she had completely lost her mind. A massive rock concert? Me? A half-deaf, grieving 50-year-old former choir teacher who could barely find the physical strength to brush her own hair in the morning? I begged her to take a friend instead. I pleaded. I cried. I told her it would be a terrible waste of money and an absolute torture for my failing ears. But Sarah simply wouldn't take no for an answer. She looked me dead in the eye and told me she was not going to sit back and watch me rot away in that armchair. She physically pulled me up, helped me put on my coat, and practically dragged me out of the house and into her car. The drive from Providence up to Boston felt like a slow march to an execution. I stared out the passenger window at the gray highway, my heart heavy with a profound, suffocating dread. When we finally arrived at the arena, the sheer, magnificent scale of the event completely overwhelmed my fragile senses. There were thousands upon thousands of people. Young, vibrant, beautiful people dressed in leather and denim, laughing, shouting, radiating a kind of life that felt entirely foreign to me. And then there was me, standing there in my conservative winter coat. I felt like a sad ghost haunting a spectacular celebration I had absolutely no business attending. The air was buzzing with an electric anticipation that I couldn't share. We found our seats in the massive stadium, and when the house lights finally went down and the first explosive chords echoed through the building, the brutal reality of my brokenness hit me harder than ever before. For a normal person, that music was a triumph. It was joyous, powerful, and wildly alive. But for me, with my right ear barely clinging to distorted fragments of sound and my left ear completely dead, it was a chaotic, terrifying physical assault. The heavy bass vibrated through the floorboards and rattled deep in my chest, but the beautiful melodies were horribly twisted into a cacophony of metallic shrieks and muffled, painful thuds. It wasn't music anymore. It was just a loud, violent reminder of everything the universe had taken from me. I tried to smile for Sarah, I really did. I watched her jumping and singing along to Joyride, her bright face illuminated by the flashing stage lights, and my broken heart just shattered all over again. I couldn't do it. The stark contrast between her radiant joy and my absolute inner devastation was simply too much to bear. Tears, hot and entirely uncontrollable, started spilling down my wrinkled cheeks. I leaned over, touched her arm, and signaled that I needed to go find a restroom, desperately needing just a few minutes of quiet to compose myself. I pushed my way through the dense, sweaty crowd, keeping my head down, feeling so incredibly old, so incredibly fragile, and so utterly pathetic. I just wanted to disappear completely. I stumbled out of the main arena and wandered blindly down a dimly lit concrete backstage corridor, far away from the pulsating lights and the crushing noise. The heavy metal doors closed behind me, muffling the roar of the massive crowd into a dull, distant throb. I found a cold concrete wall, leaned my tired back against it, slid down to the hard floor, and buried my face in my trembling hands. I sat there in the shadows, an invisible broken woman weeping in the belly of a massive arena, wishing the ground would just open up and swallow me whole. I thought about my beautiful mahogany piano back home in Providence, sitting cold and silent in the dark. The crushing weight of my uselessness pressed down on my chest so hard I could barely pull air into my lungs. I was entirely convinced that this was my absolute bottom, the lowest point of my entire existence. I thought I was completely alone in that bleak, freezing hallway. I had absolutely no idea that the universe had guided me to that exact spot and that my life was about to change forever. I sat there on that freezing concrete floor for what felt like an eternity, my knees pulled tightly to my chest, letting decades of repressed sorrow finally pour out of me. The muffled thud of the bass drum from the distant stage felt exactly like the incredibly slow, heavy beating of my own broken heart. I was so completely consumed by my own misery, by the suffocating grief of my lost music and my lost identity, that I didn't even notice the heavy metal door at the far end of the corridor swing violently open. Suddenly, the dim hallway was flooded with a blinding slice of harsh yellow light and a sudden massive rush of chaotic, frantic energy. A large group of people came bursting through the doorway. It was a whirlwind of rushed footsteps, anxious voices, and loud walkie-talkies echoing off the cinder block walls. It was clearly a rapid wardrobe change or a desperate mid-show break for the band. I panicked. I felt a sudden, intense wave of profound embarrassment wash over me. I was a respectable 50-year-old former choir teacher, and here I was, curled up on a filthy arena floor like a lost, terrified child, mascara running down my wrinkled cheeks. I tried to press myself harder against the cold wall, desperately hoping the shadows would swallow me up before anyone noticed my pathetic state. I held my breath, squeezed my eyes completely shut, and prayed they would all just rush right past me. But the frantic footsteps suddenly stopped. The chaotic chorus of voices from the security guards and the backstage crew abruptly went completely silent. I slowly opened my tear-filled eyes, and my heart completely stopped in my chest. Standing there, no more than 20 feet away from me, surrounded by massive men in black shirts who looked utterly confused by her sudden halt, was Marie Fredriksson. She was breathing heavily from the sheer physical exertion of the performance. Her iconic, perfectly styled platinum blonde hair was damp with sweat. She was wearing a stunning, elaborate stage outfit that practically radiated superstar energy. Yet standing there in that harsh lighting, she looked incredibly human and incredibly real. Her handlers were urgently gesturing for her to keep moving, aggressively pointing at their watches, silently screaming that thousands of screaming fans were waiting for her back out under the blinding stage lights. But Marie wasn't looking at them. She wasn't looking at the open door to her dressing room. She was looking directly, unblinkingly, at me. Out of all the people in that massive building, out of the tens of thousands of adoring fans who would have given absolutely anything for just one single second of her attention, this global rock icon froze completely in her tracks simply because she saw a broken older woman crying in the dark. I was entirely paralyzed. I couldn't breathe. I fully expected her to motion for her massive security guards to gently escort the crazy old lady out of the restricted backstage area. Instead, she did something that entirely shattered my understanding of how the world worked. She raised one slender hand, silencing her entire frantic entourage with a single, absolute gesture of authority. Then she stepped away from the protective, urgent bubble of her team and began walking slowly toward me. The closer she got, the more terrified I became. But as she knelt right down on that filthy, disgusting concrete floor, completely ignoring the fact that she was ruining her beautiful stage clothes, I finally looked deeply into her face. And that is when the world simply stopped spinning. Marie didn't look at me with pity. She didn't look at me with the polite, distant, and clinical concern of a celebrity dealing with an eccentric fan who had wandered into the wrong hallway. She looked at me with an astonishing, overwhelming reservoir of pure, unfiltered human empathy. Those beautiful, intense eyes of hers held a profound, quiet understanding of deep emotional pain. It was as if she could see right through my conservative, damp winter coat, right through my physical age, directly into the shattered, bleeding remnants of my soul. In that silent, breathless moment, sitting on the cold floor of a Boston arena, my terrible deafness didn't matter anymore. because Marie wasn't trying to speak to my broken ears. She was speaking directly to my broken heart. For the very first time in years, the crushing weight lifted just a fraction. I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt entirely, perfectly, and wonderfully seen. Gemini Dijo, I held my breath completely, trapped in a frozen moment of absolute disbelief as Marie Fredriksson rested her knees on that gritty concrete floor, right at my eye level. The deafening roar of the thousands of screaming fans waiting for her out in the arena felt suddenly a million miles away. Up close, I could see the frantic rise and fall of her chest from the intense performance, the bright stage makeup framing those incredibly kind, piercing eyes. My own body was trembling violently, shaking not just from the bitter chill of the drafty stadium hallway, but from the raw, agonizing exposure of my own broken soul. I was a weeping, pathetic mess of a woman, fully expecting to be scolded or swiftly removed by the towering security guards who loomed impatiently behind her. But Marie simply reached out with her small, delicate hands and gently held my trembling arms. Her touch was incredibly warm, deeply grounding, and entirely devoid of any rush or annoyance. She didn't treat me like an interruption. She treated me like a human being in desperate need of an anchor. She looked at me, taking in my tears, my conservative coat, and the profound, silent terror in my eyes. Because of my severe deafness, the chaotic sounds of the backstage crew shouting at her to hurry up were just a harsh metallic blur in my right ear. But the silence between Marie and me felt absolutely holy. She noticed my violent shivering. Without breaking our intense eye contact, she turned her head slightly and snapped a quick, authoritative command to one of her frantic assistants hovering nervously in the shadows. A second later, a soft, dark fabric was quickly handed to her. It was this very blouse. A simple, elegant, incredibly soft piece of clothing meant to keep her warm between grueling wardrobe changes. Marie took the blouse in her own hands, turned back to me, and with a tenderness that still makes my chest ache 30 years later, she leaned forward and carefully draped it over my shaking shoulders. She didn't just toss it at me, she wrapped it around me, her hands firmly holding the collar near my neck, physically pulling the warmth into my freezing bones. She leaned her face incredibly close to mine. I couldn't hear the exact words she spoke over the ringing in my damaged ears and the muffled thunder of the distant crowd. But I didn't need to hear the perfect syllables to understand the absolute perfection of her message. I read the gentle shape of her lips, and I felt the incredibly soothing, rhythmic vibration of her voice. She was telling me to breathe. She was telling me that I was safe. In that fleeting, monumental exchange, a global superstar gave me the one thing no doctor, no medication, and no amount of forced pity had been able to give me. Radical, undeniable validation. She didn't know my name. She didn't know that I had lost my music, my piano, or my entire will to live. But she saw a frightened older woman sitting in the dark, and she fundamentally decided that I was worth stopping the entire world for. The second the heavy, soft fabric of that blouse settled onto my shoulders, an actual physical shift happened deep inside my chest. It felt exactly like a massive, suffocating block of ice finally beginning to crack under the sudden bright warmth of the morning sun. It was an armor woven from pure, unexpected kindness. As Marie gave my shoulders one last, firm, reassuring squeeze, flashed me a breathtakingly beautiful smile, and finally stood up to run back into the blinding lights of her extraordinary life, I sat there in the dim hallway, clutching the dark fabric tightly to my heart. The tears were still falling down my wrinkled cheeks, but they were no longer tears of hopeless, suffocating despair. They were the warm, relieving tears of a miraculous, quiet resurrection. For the first time in incredibly long, agonizing years, the crushing, heavy darkness in my mind actually parted, and a single, tiny, beautiful ray of light finally broke through. The moment Marie disappeared back into the deafening roar of the arena, leaving me alone in that dimly lit concrete hallway, a profound and immediate shift occurred inside my chest. I remained sitting on the cold floor, my trembling hands clutching the dark, soft fabric of the blouse she had just wrapped around my frail shoulders. I pulled it tighter against my neck, burying my face into the collar. It smelled faintly of hairspray, stage makeup, and an undeniable, overwhelming warmth. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in what felt like a painful eternity, the absolute silence in my left ear and the distorted metallic ringing in my right ear did not matter at all. The suffocating, aggressive void that had taken up residence in my soul since the day I closed my piano was suddenly pierced by a brilliant, undeniable beam of light. I wasn't magically cured of my deafness, and my life back in Providence was still exactly the same quiet, empty house waiting for me. But the paralyzing spell of my deep, consuming sorrow was completely broken. A global icon, a woman adored by millions of people, had looked past the screaming crowds and the flashing cameras to see a broken, invisible old woman crying in the shadows. If someone like Marie Fredriksson could stop the entire world just to show me such a radical, beautiful act of grace, then maybe, just maybe, I was not as useless and discarded as I had convinced myself I was. Maybe I was still worthy of being seen. I don't know exactly how long I sat there, wrapped in that sudden, miraculous comfort. But eventually, the heavy metal door swung open again. This time, it wasn't a whirlwind of security guards and rock stars. It was my niece, Sarah. Her face was pale with absolute panic, her young eyes darting frantically around the dim corridor until they finally landed on me. She rushed over, dropping to her knees right where Marie had been just moments before. She started apologizing profusely, her voice shaking, thinking the overwhelming noise of the concert had driven me into a severe panic attack, entirely blaming herself for dragging me out of the house. But as she reached out to gently help me up, her hands brushed against the unfamiliar, high-quality fabric draped securely over my shoulders. She stopped, completely confused, and looked at the blouse, then back up at my tear-stained face. I didn't have the words to explain the absolute miracle that had just happened in that dark hallway. I simply looked at her, and for the first time in years, a genuine, completely unforced smile broke through the heavy, tired lines on my face. I let Sarah help me to my feet, and as we walked slowly back through the crowded, chaotic stadium corridors toward the exit, I didn't feel like a ghost haunting a celebration anymore. I felt entirely human. I felt safely tethered back to the earth. The long drive back home to Rhode Island that night was entirely different from the agonizing, dreadful journey there. The dark highway stretched out endlessly before us, and the bitter winter wind howled aggressively against the car windows, but I felt completely shielded. I kept my hands resting gently on the soft fabric of the blouse the entire way. It was no longer just a simple piece of clothing. It was my personal, impenetrable armor against the devastating darkness that had tried to claim my life. That night, when I finally walked back into my silent, empty house, I didn't immediately go to my bedroom and pull the heavy covers over my head to hide from the world like I usually did. I walked straight into the living room, stood in the center of the quiet space, and looked directly at my closed mahogany piano. I didn't open the heavy wooden lid just yet, but for the very first time in years, looking at it didn't feel like a devastating physical blow to my chest. The suffocating weight was finally gone. The long, freezing winter of my soul was ending. The thaw had begun. The morning after that unforgettable night in Boston, I woke up in my own bed, and for the very first time in years, the crushing, invisible weight that usually pinned me to the mattress was entirely gone. The absolute silence in my damaged ears was still exactly the same. The terrible metallic ringing had not miraculously vanished overnight, and my left ear remained as dead as the heavy winter air outside. But as I slowly opened my eyes and watched the pale Rhode Island sunlight filtering through the gaps in the living room curtains, I realized that the silence no longer felt like a violent enemy. It no longer felt like a suffocating tomb. It just felt like a quiet morning. I sat up, pulled the heavy blankets aside, and looked at the chair in the corner of my bedroom. Resting there, carefully folded with an almost religious reverence, was the dark, soft blouse Marie Fredriksson had wrapped around my freezing shoulders. It wasn't just a piece of fabric anymore. It was a tangible, undeniable proof that I had been seen, that my profound pain had been recognized by another human soul, and that I was still inherently worthy of living. Healing from that kind of all-consuming sorrow is never a perfectly straight line. There were still days when the grief of losing my music threatened to swallow me whole. Days when the bitter cold of the Providence winter made my bones ache and my spirit violently waver. But the absolute darkness never fully claimed me again, because I now possessed an impenetrable shield. Whenever that familiar, terrifying numbness started to creep back into my chest, I would walk straight to my closet, reach out with trembling hands, and simply touch the soft material of that blouse. I would close my eyes and instantly transport myself back to that freezing concrete hallway. I would remember the intense, beautiful warmth of Marie's hands on my arms, the fierce, unconditional empathy in her eyes, and the absolute certainty that she had stopped her entire chaotic world just to make sure an invisible old woman was safe. That single, profound memory was always enough to break the spell of my depression. It became my anchor, securely tethering me back to the vibrant world of the living. Slowly, cautiously, I began to let the colors back into my life. I finally walked over to my beloved mahogany piano and lifted the heavy wooden lid. I couldn't hear the perfect pitch of the keys anymore, but I placed my hands flat against the polished wood, pressed down on the lower chords, and let the deep, rich vibrations travel up my arms and straight into my chest. I realized that my body could still feel the music, even if my ears could not. I started answering the telephone when my niece Sarah called. I started opening my front door, stepping out onto the porch, and actually breathing in the crisp, cold air without wishing my story was over. I began volunteering at a local community center, teaching young children how to read sheet music, using my hands and my heart to guide them when my hearing failed me. I found a completely new rhythm to my existence. I wasn't the exact same woman I was before the silence took over, but I was no longer a ghost. I was alive, I was breathing, and my heart was beating with a renewed, fierce gratitude for every single day. The extraordinary kindness of a global superstar had quietly given me a beautiful second chance at life, and I swore to myself that I would never, ever let her incredible gift go to waste. Over 3 decades have passed since that freezing November night in Boston. I am 83 years old now. My hands tremble a little more than they used to. My steps are much slower, and my hair is entirely white. I have lived an incredibly long, quiet, and profoundly beautiful life in this small house in Providence. I never regained my hearing, but I learned to listen to the world in a completely different way. I watched my niece Sarah grow up, build a family, and have children of her own. I taught countless more kids how to feel the rhythm of a piano beneath their fingertips, even when the notes themselves were just a distant memory to me. And through all those years, through every single changing season and every quiet milestone, that dark, soft blouse has remained safely hanging in my closet. It has never just been a piece of clothing to me. It is the physical manifestation of the exact moment my life was handed back to me. But then came the winter of 2019. It was a bitterly cold December morning when Sarah came over to my house, her eyes red and already full of tears. She didn't even have to say a word. She just gently placed the morning newspaper on my kitchen table. The heavy black headline read that Marie Fredriksson had passed away after an incredibly long, courageous battle with illness. The entire world was mourning a ferocious rock star, a brilliant, iconic vocalist who had beautifully soundtracked a generation. Millions of people across the globe were crying for the fierce woman on the stage. But I sat alone in my quiet living room, holding that faded newspaper, mourning an absolute angel who had quietly stepped out of the blinding lights to save an invisible broken woman in the dark. I walked slowly into my bedroom, took the blouse out of the closet, and held it tightly against my chest, letting the tears fall just as freely as they had all those decades ago in that arena hallway. Only this time, I wasn't weeping from a place of suffocating, desperate despair. I was weeping from a place of absolute, overwhelming gratitude. I grieved for the physical pain she endured at the end of her life, but I fiercely celebrated the monumental, undeniable light she had left behind. I am sharing my story with you today, reaching out through this screen, because I desperately need you to understand the staggering, life-saving power of a single act of radical kindness. You do not need to be a famous global superstar to completely change the entire trajectory of someone's existence. You have absolutely no idea what the people walking past you on the street are secretly carrying. You have no idea who is sitting in the dark, entirely convinced that they are completely invisible and completely out of hope. A gentle, sincere smile, an unexpected moment of genuine eye contact, or a simple, selfless gesture can literally be the anchor that pulls someone back from the edge of the abyss. You might be the Marie Fredriksson in someone else's life today. Do not ever underestimate the beautiful ripple effect of your own empathy. Thank you for taking the time to listen to an old woman's memories. And to Marie, wherever your beautiful, radiant soul is resting now, thank you. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't even see myself.